So I'm going to talk about global climate risk perceptions. And the first question is, well, why does the public perception of climate risk matter? I mean, if experts know what the problems are and they can communicate those to governments, then do we need to worry about public perceptions at all? And we do, I think, because the incentives for governments and for firms in their decisions to take account of climate change and the risk that that poses in the long term are weak, if not for the pressure that they get from the decisions made by the public in terms of their consumption and lifestyle choices, their voting decisions, of course, their electoral behavior, as well as their civil engagement and activism. And it's not just that a small group of motivated publics need to be very active in the climate domain, but they need to be supported by the general public in order to have an effect on policy and on the decisions of firms. And there's another reason, maybe an even more direct reason why the public perception of risk matters. And that's that possibly that the anxiety that climate change causes to people might have direct impacts on their health. I don't know if you saw, it was picked up in the media, there's a preprint in the journal The Lancet, which is arguing that climate anxiety is perhaps having important negative physical effects on psychosocial effects on young people and children nowadays. I leave it with a question mark, it hasn't been peer reviewed yet, but it's possible that climate anxiety is having direct effects on public health. And it may also be exacerbating youth disillusionment and social division, all of which will be important to society and to well-being in other ways. I don't know if you've got any in your head, if you've got the sort of facts and figures. I'm not sure what you would guess if I said, well, what proportion of people are very concerned about climate change. So let me just give you a quick set of charts. These are charts from the Pew Research Center based in the US. Pew's been surveying people on climate risk and sort of associated factors for more than a decade now. And these are the results from their most recent Global Attitude Survey in 21, compared with the 2015 Global Attitude Survey. What can we see here? So these are all advanced economies. And we can see that less than half of the people surveyed in each one say that they're very concerned about global climate change and the harm that would do to them personally at some point in their lifetime. Maybe more encouraging, we can see that in most of these countries, with the exception of Japan, we can see that there's an increase over time. So people are becoming more concerned. Although I guess we should note that there were 17 countries covered in the survey, and these are the only ones that show a statistical difference between the 2015 and the 2021 results. So in other places, the change may not have been quite so marked. In fact, there's a proliferation of surveys around public perceptions of climate risk. And I'm researching it, I'm trying to keep up. And even for me, it's difficult to really keep track of the number of surveys that are being done at the national level, at the subnational level, different groups of countries and different regions and so on. And from all of this proliferation, however, it's really difficult to get a global picture. Even surveys that are multi-country tend to cover maybe 10, maybe up to 20, and usually advanced economies. And it's very difficult for us to get a sense of what's going on in the rest of the world. And when we try to pick up patterns, are we just picking out patterns in this sort of subset of countries, rather than really getting a global picture? And we can't just kind of bring all these surveys together in an easy meta-analysis and say, well, this will give us the global picture, because the surveys are actually asking different questions. And this little table shows you some of those sort of different ways of framing the question around climate risk, which make it difficult for us to compare. So the differences are in terms of the risk measure, the risk target, like what is it that's at risk? Yourself, your community, your country, the globe, the source of risk. There's the distinction between climate change and global warming, but there are also other surveys that ask specifically about extreme weather or sea level rise. And then there's what's the risk perception that we're asking about? What's the dimension? Well, sometimes it's worry, sometimes it's a more specific kind of cognitive risk assessment. Sometimes we ask about probability or harm if the risk manifests. And there's also the question of the time frame that the question is being asked about. Is it right now, in the future, in your lifetime, or is there a specific time frame put upon it? So up until now, it's been really quite hard to get this sort of convincing, consistent global picture of climate risks. But from the research that has been done, what do we know about the factors that are correlated with and help to explain individual climate risk? We can divide these up into 5. We've got the cognitive ones, so that's relating to knowledge of causes, impacts, and responses to climate change. We've got experiential ones, referring specifically to the experience of extreme weather and linking that, I guess, in the mind to climate change. But the experiential one's interesting because there are 2 ways that this could play. It's possible that people who experience extreme weather and experience harm from it do become more concerned about climate change. But what about people who are in areas affected by extreme weather, but they're the one house standing, or they're amongst the small group of households that don't suffer any harm? That actually feeds into a bias that psychologists have identified, sort of the Superman bias, or more broadly, the optimism bias, that we believe ourselves, we're going to be people who don't suffer, even though those around us might. So the jury's out on the relationship between extreme weather and climate risk perceptions. We've got psychological dimensions. There's a disposition to worry. Well, maybe people who are worried about climate change are just worried about everything. They're worriers. They worry about public health and road accidents and pollution. And so they also worry about climate change. And that by asking questions specific about climate change, we're ignoring the fact that these people are just worriers. But there's a contrary argument, that's the finite pool of worry, which says, well, actually, people only have so much brain space for anxiety. And if people are worried about their jobs or COVID-19, then they're going to be less worried about climate change. That seems plausible, but it hasn't been demonstrated convincingly empirically. So the jury's out on this one as well. We've got sociocultural factors. And one of the key ones here identified in the literature, mainly drawing on research from the US, is political orientation. And the observation in many of those studies was that the factor with the greatest explanatory power in determining whether people had high or low climate risk perceptions was whether they were more Republican leaning and had lower risk perceptions, or whether they were more Democrat leaning and had higher risk perceptions. So the question then is, does that effect exist elsewhere? And some studies have found it, although with much less power in some other advanced democracies. But when we look at the world more generally, the effect doesn't seem to hold. Another important value is the extent to which the individual values the environment. And in a very deep and thorough analysis with a small sample that I've got in the list of references here by van der Linden, he finds that environmental values is the factor with the strongest explanatory power. And then we've got sociodemographics, gender, age, education, income. The studies here found different things. Again, if we look at advanced economies, there tends to be a finding that women worry more than men. But when we look at the rest of the world, then that doesn't hold. In terms of age, in advanced economies, again, we see a distinction between young people caring more about climate change. But when we look at a bigger pool, a bigger population, again, that effect doesn't seem to hold. Education works both ways around. In some countries like the US, studies have actually found that more education can be related to more climate skepticism. What about when we look at the world as a whole, though? And income. So income also has actually a positive, a significant effect, but the effect size is very small. Now I have an opportunity with a great new data set to actually try to answer some of these questions. And that's the World Risk Poll. So this was a huge survey, international survey, conducted in 2019, so just prior to COVID, with more than 140,000 respondents, 140 countries. at least 1,000 respondents per country and bigger samples in some of the bigger countries. And it's got a question specifically on climate change, which is nicely worded in terms of from the researcher's point of view, because it's very precise. Do you think that climate change is a very serious threat, somewhat, or not a threat at all, to people in this country in the next 20 years? And there were also some questions on extreme weather. How worried are you that extreme weather could cause you serious harm? How likely is that? Have you or someone you know personally experienced severe harm? Plus a whole bunch of other questions on other risks, including food, water, crime, mental health, and so on, which we're able to use for the analysis. Let's take a quick look then at some of the descriptive statistics just by gender, education, and age. Again, I'm not sure whether this would be a surprise to you, and I'm not sure whether when you look at it and you see that just under half the respondents said that climate change was a very serious risk, whether that seems like a low number to you or a high number. You know, is there a threshold above which governments care? Is there a correct level of concern? I'm not sure. Let's come back to that in the discussion. But what we can see here is a very slim difference between men and women. Remembering at this stage, we're not controlling for any other factors. But we see a clear education effect. In terms of very serious, we've got roughly 40% of people with only primary education considering it to be a very serious concern, rising up to 56% for those with tertiary education. And we see some kind of age effect. It's not a particularly striking one, but we see that in our lowest age group, that concern seems to be a bit lower. Let's carry on and take a look at what more we can get when we start to do regression analysis and control for some of these factors. What can we see then? So our approach, I'll just describe some of the details here. You can see the full set of regression results from our core set of specifications on the right. I'll go into the details in the next slide. We construct a binary variable as our dependent variable, so that combines serious and somewhat serious, and distinguishes it from not serious at all. For this, we drop don't knows, but I'll come back to don't knows. We do a set of checks and extensions. So we construct and run regressions for a second binary variable, which is looking at the difference between people who said don't know and everybody else. We also construct an ordinal variable with serious, somewhat serious, and not serious. So we run that as a robustness check. The results of that are a bit harder, less intuitive to interpret. So I'll stick to the core binary variable results in the discussion. And then we do some subsample analysis as well, and I'll describe those in a sec. Control variables, we've got age, gender, education, income, religion. So we all from the survey, so we can include all of those. And we also include country fixed effects. So we're aware that there may well be differences at the country level, which are not captured in the survey and for which we've got no reliable proxy. So we include the fixed effects in the regression in order to try to deal with that. And then we'll use the subsample analysis to see if we can dig into what some of those differences might be. Our independent variables, the core variables of interest, we've got the extreme weather ones, so worry, likelihood, and whether you experienced it. We construct a worry score, that's to deal with this sort of disposition to worry. And so we use the questions in the survey about levels of worry about other sort of non-extreme weather hazards, and use that to give a score to each person of their, I guess, propensity or disposition to worry. We've also got a variable on internet use, which we interpret as a proxy for access to information. We've got something on health problems, which we can use to help us investigate that question of the finite pool of worry. So if people have got big health problems, maybe they'll be less worried about climate change. And then there are a few questions on environmental concern and perceptions of the quality of the local environment. In terms of attitudes and beliefs, we do not have everything that we would wish for. And I guess that's the downside of a survey. We've got this huge sample, but we don't have all the variables that we would like. What we do have is a variable on the importance of religion to the respondent and their level of confidence in national government. So we incorporate those into the regression too. these are some of the results that I'd like to just highlight and talk with you. So what I've got here are the results for two of our models. So model 3, which includes our kind of our base control variables plus our core variables of interest, and model 6, which includes some other variables too, a bit more exploratory, but the explanatory power is higher. So I think it's interesting to look at that one too. And in the two little figures, what you've got is just a graphical representation of the effect size, only for selected significant results. So we drop from these the results that are not significant. And what you can see here is that worrying about extreme weather is a powerful explanatory factor in terms of climate risk perceptions. So this is a logit regression. So what we've got, so these effects are the probability of concern compared to the reference group. And in this case, for all the extreme weather ones, the reference group is people who answered don't know. So being worried about extreme weather made you more likely, 1.72 times more likely to consider climate change a serious risk. If you considered harm from extreme weather to be likely, it's still significant, but the effect size is much smaller, but much stronger in the other direction. So those people who considered extreme weather to be not likely to harm them are significantly less likely than the don't knows to be concerned about climate. And remember, we're talking about different risk targets here. The questions about extreme weather are about harm to you, and the questions about climate change are about harm to people in your country. So there isn't necessarily a relationship between them. What we're seeing is that there does seem to be significant explanatory power. Experience of extreme weather is significant and positive in our core specification, and so is the worry score. I think the worry score, the point here is maybe not so much interpreting that in itself, but that this is a signal to us that where possible, we should be including a variable capturing disposition to worry in our analysis of climate risk perceptions, because otherwise we may be over-exaggerating. We may be capturing the tendency of a person to worry about everything and then attributing that to climate change. So I think where possible, we should be seeking to include this kind of variable in future analysis. If we look at the larger regression, including more variables, we see that the extreme weather likely variable drops out in terms of significance. So does extreme weather experience. But we find that internet use, so access to information, is significant. And so are these variables around satisfaction with environmental quality. So the questions here are you satisfied with efforts of the government to ensure environmental quality? People who are dissatisfied are much more likely to worry about climate change. Similar question for quality of air and quality of water. And those who are dissatisfied are more concerned about climate change. A quick word about some of the controls. So we find that taking into account education, income, everything else, that men are slightly less likely, are significantly but slightly less likely to worry about climate change. And we find strong evidence for the education effect. So people with tertiary education are 2.5 times more likely to worry about climate change than those with primary education, which is the reference group for those variables. Okay, then let me come on to this country level characteristics. So we know that countries are different from one another, and in the fixed effect, we see lots of significance, but there isn't an obvious pattern. Let's look at this, this world map. So what this shows is the proportion of respondents in the country who said that climate change was a very serious threat. Well, there's obviously a kind of Latin American and Central American thing. From Mexico down to Patagonia, there is a very wide range of geographic, socioeconomic conditions. We're capturing a huge range of and different political governance structures. So while there seems to be a sort of regional pattern there, it's difficult to interpret in terms of any of the underlying factors that we might think are important. And then if we look across a swathe of the world where we would expect climate risks to be particularly highly perceived, in places that are in any case hot and vulnerable to drought, to heat waves, we see comparatively lower levels of climate risk perceptions. So the puzzle is still there. And what we've tried to do was to look at to identify a few other factors which we thought might plausibly help to explain differences across countries. And so we collected data on emissions. So the argument was that maybe countries with high emissions, people are less open to changing their lifestyle, and so maybe perceive lower climate risks. We collected data on natural hazards from the MDAT database. We constructed a sort of 10-year cumulative impact of disasters in the country. So that's natural hazards at the national level. And then we used a democracy measure. We used these to order the countries and then to divide the countries into terciles. And then for each third of those countries, we then conducted the full regression analysis over again. And we looked for any differences in the results, either in terms of significance, effect size, or most importantly, the direction of the effect. Well, the results did not generate much. We really found few observable differences despite poring over these results. One thing we did find, though, which I think is maybe worth highlighting, is that the variable which we have, which captures individual climate hazard experience, that is consistently significant across models in low population affected countries, but not in medium and high affected countries. So what does that mean? Maybe in places where there's a lot of exposure in the news and perhaps through kind of family and friends to natural hazards, the experience of the individual experience matters less. But if you're not aware of those kinds of things happening in your country and it happens to you, maybe it has a more profound impact on your perception of climate risk. What are the implications of all of this? I think one thing that we can say for sure is that increasing knowledge is critical. We see the impact of education. We see the impact of access to information on climate risk perceptions. And I think perhaps seeing some of the studies that have been done in sort of advanced economies, we became a bit cynical about education. Like, well, is there any point trying to teach people more if it doesn't really change people's minds? But at the global level, it's really clear that sort of basic education, as well as access to information, has a real positive impact on people's understanding of climate risks. And so fully worthwhile in terms of all the scientists, other experts, professionals, and others who engage in climate risk communication. And I think we also see that both affective and cognitive dimensions are important. So affective, that's the worry bit, and cognitive, the knowledge bit. These two dimensions which come together in our risk perception. We also see that experiencing extreme weather is not critical to being concerned about climate change. Sometimes, people working in this area kind of throw up their hands and think, is it necessary for everybody to suffer a severe storm in order to get them to care about climate change? I think what this analysis points to is that it's not. As long as people know about those weather events and they're able to interpret them in a way that connects them with climate change, and in this, attribution studies obviously play a critical role, as well as the way that journalists report about them, then it's not necessary for everybody to experience it. We don't have to endure that kind of terrible impact in order for people to take climate change seriously. Then there's the gender dimension. A lot of what the gender discussion has been about is, do women in general worry more than men? And what we're able to do by using this sort of worry score in this analysis is to separate out that extra worry that women have about climate change, which maybe goes beyond their this general predisposition to worry. And I suspect that there could be really good reasons for that. That women could be both more exposed and more vulnerable to climate change. Could also be related to the things that they value being more at risk. And I think investigating that dimension of gender and climate change is both an interesting and important one. In terms of future research directions, well, what I and my team are doing at the moment is in part looking at the evaluation of communications interventions. So doing experimental studies on providing people with different information and information framed differently to see how that affects their climate risk perceptions. And I think even more importantly for us right now, how that affects their propensity to support certain policy actions. And secondly, to examine the relationship between policy ambition and public perceptions. You know, if close to 50%, and in many countries, a majority of people are very concerned about climate change, how is that message not getting across to policymakers? Or is there something that we can do to communicate the risk perception back in that direction towards experts and towards decision makers that might help to influence policy in a more ambitious direction? Here's a question to end with, and maybe to for discussion. How much should we worry about climate change? I don't know if any of you saw the PUB video that was part of their communications campaign in kind of March, April this year. So this is the faces of a couple of parents whose son is about to be consumed by an enormous wave down at East Coast Park. And what this video is doing clearly, trying to engage our emotions and engage fear. That fear is often considered to be a prerequisite for action. And much of climate risk communication has focused on trying to trigger that affective response. But which response does it actually trigger? Well, it triggers a response to protect ourselves and our immediate family. But what if the response that we're looking for is a different one? What about if it's a public-facing one, to engage more actively in our communities and to engage more actively at the civil society and even the political level to try to influence the direction of government policy? If that's the action we're looking for, then is the affective communications approach going to be the most effective one? That's something we're going to try and explore with these forthcoming experiments. And I'm going to finish with, as David mentioned at the beginning, a conference that's coming up and in which I'm very much busy with organizing, and to which I would like to invite you all to participate. It's going to be a hybrid event, which is incredibly exciting and a bit terrifying. We might actually see each other in person in December. So it's taking place in Singapore at the Orchard Hotel, but also online to ensure that we can get some really great global participation. There's a core program, which is covering things like risk-based decision-making. There's going to be a focus on climate. There's going to be a focus on cities on the front line, as well as communicating risk. But there's also plenty of scope for those who are interested to propose community sessions. So those will be other panels or activities or showcases that we can feature online. And the whole of this global audience, very large and very active UR community, will be able to access online. So a great chance for exposure. And then if others would like to, people would like to participate in other ways, helping us with the program, getting involved in kind of facilitation, helping with speakers or preparing materials, all of that would be super welcome as well. But most of all, I would like you to participate because I would like to see people, and it would be fantastic to have as many people as possible there. So I'll finish with that. Thank you very much.